It was January 4th, 2018, inside a hospital in the city of Rugby, England. A confusing situation was unfolding at the same time, but in different places. In one of the emergency rooms, doctors and paramedics were trying to understand why a child only 3 years old had arrived there with serious difficulty breathing. The situation was very serious and also unexpected, and at that moment there was still no clear cause. Meanwhile, just a few meters away in the hospital bathroom, there was also a woman standing still. In front of the mirror, with her cell phone in hand, she was fixing her hair, trying out some angles, and taking pictures. Very intimate photos, I would say images that had nothing to do with the hospital, with any illness or any kind of emergency. She seemed to just be there. They were personal photos, as I said, intimate, and she would send them to some people. And the two scenes, very distinct I would say, were happening at the same time, without one seeming to interfere with the other. On the outside, no one saw anything strange. Doctors were doing their jobs, protocols were being followed. A mother was waiting inside the hospital. The child who was receiving that care was named Lexi, and after minutes of tension, the doctors managed to turn the little girl's situation around. Lexi survived. Even without fully understanding what had caused such a severe respiratory arrest, the medical team managed to stabilize the child, but without a conclusive diagnosis. A short time later, Lexi was discharged and went back home, so the episode was recorded as a scare, just a strange case, but closed. At least that's what everyone believed at that moment. I'm Marcos Campos, welcome everyone. And this story begins with a simple question. What was really happening in that hospital that day? If you like to learn about real stories with lots of details, go ahead and subscribe here. Become a member. If you can, leave a comment, even if it's just an emoji. Announcements made, let's get to the facts. After surviving that episode at the hospital, Lexi went back home with her mother. Everything was fine. The doctors still didn't have a definitive explanation, as we saw. What they did know was that the child had suffered a very serious respiratory condition, way too serious for someone so little. But there were no clear signs of any infection or chronic illness, and the case ended up being treated as an isolated incident. It was really a scare, but that wasn't the first scare. 2 days earlier, on January 2nd, Lexi had already been taken to the hospital by her own mother, with very similar symptoms: difficulty breathing, feeling unwell, something that was clearly not normal, and at that moment, no one suspected anything. After all, children get sick, don't they? Crises happen and mothers seek medical help just like that child's mother was doing. At least that's how it should be. But what nobody at the hospital knew is that while the doctors were trying to understand what was happening to her daughter, that mother was living a parallel life, quite active in the... I think you've already connected the dots, haven't you? On her phone, dating apps, conversations with some people, some men, constant exchange of messages, photos, replies. And the weirdest detail, I would say, none of this stopped while her daughter was in the hospital, not understanding anything, going through emergency care. On January 4th itself, that episode I started, today's story, while Alex was there between life and death, the doctors didn't know what was happening. Her mother was there in the bathroom. Yeah, that woman who was there in front of the mirror taking pictures, intimate pictures, posing like that, right? And she was sending them to people, to her contacts. All of this in exchange for money. Not satisfied, she even gave her phone number to a hospital security guard. Can you believe it? All during that same period, okay? She exchanged 87 messages with this man. The subject was business. It was like two parallel realities coexisting there. On one side, exhausted doctors trying to save that little child. And on the other, a woman who was treating everything there as if it was just another ordinary day in her life. Even so, Lexi was discharged again, went back home, and for a brief moment it seemed like the story had ended there. In other words, just to make it clear, on January 4th it was already the second time she was there, okay? But how can I put this? Predictably, things didn't end there, did they? About 2 weeks later, the mother called the United Kingdom Emergency Service again. On the other end of the line, the operator asked about the child's condition, if she was breathing, and the answer was direct and cold. I would say no.
Ambulance service, is the patient breathing? No, they're not breathing.
No? Okay, and who was it we're talking about?
Lexi, she's three. She's three over here. Okay, so she's unconscious and she's not breathing. So help has been arranged. Okay, okay.
When the ambulance arrived at the house, there was nothing else that could be done. Lexi was already lifeless. The girl's body was cold, which indicated that the death hadn't been recent, right? She had been there for a while. Even so, the mother didn't seem desperate or in shock or inconsolable, quite the opposite. The day after her daughter's death, she accepted 41 friend requests on an app. There, from dating, she spent hours talking to a man on another app. That same night, she even set up a date with a guy named Leon. All the messages were there. They're recorded for investigation, dated afterwards, available to be read. In one of them, while casually talking about tattoos, she wrote the following to a man: "My daughter passed away yesterday." Just like that, without any tone of sadness, without any context, without a pause, you know? No, it was kind of like I'm trying to move on, but totally shattered. It was kind of just like, oh, my daughter died the other day, life goes on. Anyone, even minimally human, understands what grief is, right? And we know that grief happens differently for each person. But when you talk about losing a 3-year-old child, think about it with me. Anyone who has lost a pet is already totally impacted, sad. That week, that month, except, of course, if we're talking about someone completely incapable of feeling anything, not even empathy. Unfortunately, Lexi wasn't the only child in that house, okay? 18 days after all that, a new tragedy would happen, and this time there would be no second chance. Up until that point in the story, what the authorities saw was a sequence of unusual, strange events. A child who almost died, a sudden death, and a maternal behavior that simply didn't match the whole situation. But to better understand what was happening, it was necessary to go back a few years in time to understand who that woman was. Louise Porton was born in 1996, and she grew up in a family that, at least at first glance, seemed quite ordinary. Nothing extreme, nothing that at least was recorded as something that could draw attention. But from an early age, her behavior, Louise's behavior, started to differ from other people. According to family reports, Louise was already showing difficulties in her childhood. She was described as a troubled child with a tendency toward conflicts and episodes of aggression. After her parents' divorce, still in her pre-adolescence, this behavior intensified, and she started seeking attention in different ways. Problems at school started to appear. Conflicts with authority figures like teachers, people who had some kind of hierarchy there. She would kind of break that. Along with all of this, there was also poor academic performance. And there are also memories of small thefts within her own family, especially at her grandmother's house. There are reports of aggression against other children like cousins when there were no adults around. Louise also used to isolate herself frequently. There was always the feeling that she was there, plotting something, you know? It wasn't something anyone could really explain. It was a feeling that bothered people. Of course, all of this came to light later. I'm not presenting her biography based on perception after the criminal events described here, but I think you get the idea, right? At the same time, there was also another Louise. Okay, a completely different version of her that would appear depending on the situation and mainly on the convenience of the situation. This gentler side was described mainly by her mother and also by one of her sisters, but also by people who lived with her years later. Neighbors, clients, the father of the children, and even the owner of the property where she was living. Louise knew how to present herself as a nice person, if she wanted to, you know. Knowing how to please, knowing exactly what the other person wants to hear. Like that chameleon we've already seen here a few times. And while still very young, she realized something important for her mindset, the power she had over men. Still in her teenage years, Louise started using her own image as a tool. Seduction then kind of became her bargaining chip. Like a siren's song, I would say, she attracted men and got some kind of advantage from them. Usually financial, of course, but also emotional and even material. Social media then became her main stage. And here, a pun even fits. Suddenly, she was fishing for men on social media, if you know what I mean. Well, dating apps like Me Too and Badoo were used frequently. In fact, according to sources from the case, those were the apps she was using. there in the hospital bathroom during those days of mourning after the little girl's passing. For some context, everything stayed virtual, like nude photos she sent in exchange for money, but for others, the contact was more real, more physical. Louise also worked as an escort, and on some occasions, she would receive clients in her own home. And the detail here is that at that time, she was already a mother and did this with her 2 children living in that environment. And it's worth adding a disclaimer here as well. Besides, sometimes someone who doesn't know the whole story hears this and starts making inappropriate comments.
It's prejudiced, saying things about the woman who was getting involved with men.
Wow, look at all the context. She doesn't talk about whatever she wants in her life. I couldn't care less about that. We're talking about a context here where 2 little children were being neglected, being killed there by this woman. So it's not a woman, it's the manifestation of evil on earth. Forgive my frankness here, but that's what I think, I don't know, she shouldn't even have had a boyfriend to have those kids. But since she did, at least have a little bit of humanity, if she can even rescue it from the depths of the mud that must exist inside this person's soul. I don't know, maybe put the kids up for adoption, but I think she was so bad she was probably too lazy to handle the paperwork, right? You need this disclaimer, unbelievable as it sounds, because some people need it or else things get taken out of context, just for saying the word in the manual.
Oh, that's so prejudiced.
For the love of holy God, man. Anyone even slightly aware understands that bringing strangers into the house already creates a danger for the little ones. It's not even about more people. As soon as you made contact over the internet, there's a negotiation going on, right? Then the person comes in. Anyway, it's pretty dangerous, right? Pretty much from babies right in the house. And we don't have to go far to imagine the kind of people who could take advantage of a situation like this, right, guys? At many times, Louise introduced herself as a model. However, there are no records of any professional work in that field. And it's likely that this title was only used to soften what she was actually doing. She was probably trying to attract new clients. It was in this context that she met a man named Chris Draper. They got involved, Louise got pregnant by him, and that's how Alex, the little girl, was born. From the beginning of the episode, the relationship, by all indications, wasn't stable, and a few months after Alex was born, Louise got pregnant again. At that point, living with Chris was already very strained, and she ended up leaving him. She moved to a distant city, about 55 kilometers away. When the second baby was born, something caught people's attention, okay? The girl was registered with the last name of another man, not Chris's. So the youngest started being called Scarlett Vaughn. According to Chris Draper, after the separation, Louise completely cut off contact with him, as well as the contact he had with his daughters. So he wasn't able to watch Alex grow up, he never got to meet Scarlett in person, and there aren't many public details about legal disputes. Things like child support, visitation, all those things that come up when parents separate, right? Custody stuff. The fact is, Louise was left alone with the 2 children. And so we arrive at the beginning of 2018 when she was 22 years old. She was the mother of 2 very young girls, Lex, who was 3 years old, and Scarlett, who was just a year and a half. They lived in a small rented place, a place where occasionally Louise, as we saw, worked. It's less about hosting people there and more about taking her photos and such. And it was within this scenario of instability, I would say, of a parallel life, that the second tragedy happened. What happened? As I said, 18 days after everything that happened with Lex, that was the interval, guys, between Lex's death, 3 years old, and the new tragedy inside that house. During this period, nothing indicated that Louise was going through mourning, at least not in the most normal way, I would say, that everyone recognizes. She remained active on social media, talked to her clients, scheduled meetings, kept up her routine. It was as if her daughter's absence hadn't left a void in her, a wound. Then, on February 1st, 2018, it was Scarlett's turn. That night, Louise made a call asking for medical help. The call was answered and recorded as protocol requires. On the other end of the line, she explained that the 18-month-old baby wasn't doing very well, but at no point did she show any urgency about the case. She even said that the situation didn't seem serious. But the ambulance went, arrived in less than 10 minutes, and when the paramedics entered the house, they found Scarlett lifeless. Once again, something didn't add up in this story. The child's body was very cold, and signs indicated that death had occurred well before the call. It wasn't a situation where the child had just stopped breathing and the mother desperate, called for help. The doctors also noticed purplish marks on the baby's neck, signs consistent with manual strangulation. That's not the explanation that Louise gave, it was something else, okay? She said she had put Scarlett in the car seat to take her to the hospital, and that the child had died from asphyxiation because of the position of her neck. A version that conveniently tried to show initiative in seeking help, right? But the medical findings didn't support that narrative. That's where, let's be honest, right? Besides that, security camera footage from just a few hours earlier showed Scarlett walking, running. All of this was happening at the entrance of the building. Nothing compatible with a seriously ill child. And Louise also claimed 2 similar episodes, right? 2 deaths in less than 20 days, 2 small children with no history of serious illnesses. Lightning can strike the same place once, but twice in the same way would be a coincidence. It was Scarlett's death that changed everything in this story. At that moment, the previous hospital records, especially those from Lexi's visits on January 2nd and 4th, came back to the center of the discussion. The doubts started to bother people, right? And for the first time, the possibility of natural causes began to lose strength. The authorities realized that if there wasn't a disease, a syndrome, a fall, or an environmental accident to explain those deaths, what was left were external factors caused by someone. From that point on, the police investigation was officially started. With the official opening of the investigation, the detectives started doing what is now inevitable in any criminal case. It's not going back in time. Through digital footprints, cell phone, computer, browsing history, messages, and so on. And that's when Louise's story started to fall apart. Her version, which was already, let's say, not very sustainable, completely collapsed. First, the investigators revisited Lexi's medical appointments back in January. At that time, Louise had told the doctors that her daughter suffered from seizures. That information was crucial in guiding the diagnosis. The problem is that before those appointments, Louise had searched the internet about exactly that. For example, what are the possible causes for a small child to stop breathing? Seizures were among the results. In other words, when the doctors asked about the symptoms, Louise answered with what she had already researched. She was already prepared to respond. The searches continued. Is it on her phone? Searches were found about how long it takes for a body to cool down after death, and within what time frame resuscitation can still be effective. Drownings in children, medications capable of causing child death. Wow, right? Searches like these are completely unusual, morbid. Meanwhile, during the period when Lexi was still alive, hospitalized there in the hospital, Louise was sending messages to family members saying that, according to the doctors, her daughter was going to die. And this information was never confirmed by any doctor. Later, during her trial, it was revealed that she was announcing a death that hadn't happened yet. The messages exchanged after Lexi's death also drew attention. As we saw, the day after the death, Louise was active on dating apps, accepting dozens of friend requests, chatting with guys there, her clients. But there was also something even more serious. During Lexi's wake inside the funeral home, Louise was seen laughing and talking on a video call with a man. At one point, she even said that Scarlett would be next. Look, that's a phrase that, let's be honest guys, there's no justification for saying something like that, right? In the case of Scarlett's death, the digital traces were even more incriminating. Incredibly, on the night the little baby died, Louise exchanged messages with a guy named Patrick. That was at 9:22 post-meridium 9:22 at night. She wrote, asking for £30 to fill up the car. So she could take her daughter to the hospital. She promised to pay the money back after some time. In just over a minute, she sent 7 more messages saying that Scarlett wasn't well and that she was losing another baby. Then, at 9:24 post-meridium, Patrick replied very directly. He told her not to waste time and to call an ambulance. She did call, as we saw, but it was already too late. It seems like asking for help was never a priority. Money came first. As the investigation progressed, witnesses started to be questioned about all of this. The first one was the children's mother herself, and now, not just as a witness, but also as a suspect, Louise's sister as well. Sharon, the girl's aunt, revealed in text messages that Louise used to leave the children alone, locked in the house, to go out and have fun. According to her, many times she was taken advantage of to take care of the children and even to help her nieces financially. The owner of the property where Louise lived with her daughters, who was also a neighbor in the area, was interviewed by the police. She stated that she took care of the children on several occasions when Louise showed little interest. To be more formal here, okay? This neighbor? She even said that when the neighbor went there to take care of the children, Louise seemed kind of relieved to get rid of the maternal responsibility, you know. Some people said that apparently the children seemed happy, even well cared for, despite all of this. But the medical examiner's reports told a different story. During the autopsies, injuries were found on the bodies of Lexi and also Scarlett, injuries that indicated both could have been assaulted on other occasions. The doctors were cautious. They didn't state with absolute certainty the origin of those injuries, so Louise was not formally charged with previous assaults. But between us guys, if someone is capable of killing two defenseless children, wouldn't they also be capable of hurting them? Well, with all of this gathered, messages, searches, reports, testimonies, the puzzle of this case was starting to come together, wasn't it? And what once seemed like just a series of inexplicable tragedies was now pointing almost certainly to something much darker. Months after the deaths of Lexi and Scarlett, the case went to court. Louise Porton's trial began in December 2019 and lasted about 5 weeks. It was widely covered by the British press and, of course, shocked public opinion. In court, the chronological sequence of events was meticulously reconstructed. The prosecutors presented a very solid case based on material evidence, medical records, forensic reports, and testimonies from various witnesses, mainly doctors and coroners. But the most devastating set of evidence was produced by the defendant herself. The internet searches, the messages, the constant activity on social networks and dating apps before, during, and after the behavior. For those who lived with Louise, one thing became clear. She never accepted motherhood. She always wanted to be free to go out, have relationships, have casual encounters, make money, and live without any ties. In this context, her daughters were not seen as something precious, a great asset, or a priority in her life, but rather as an obstacle. That, in some way, compromised everything Louise wanted to do, and she needed to get that out of her way. So, the jury, as expected, was unanimous. Louise Porton was found guilty of the 2 murders committed inside her home, against her own daughters, crimes that were initially attempted to be presented as natural deaths. The sentence was life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 32 years. When the case became widely public, British society wondered how something so disgusting could happen without anyone noticing, at least enough to stop it. How could a mother who was living alone with her children in unstable conditions never come to the attention of a social service, for example, that could somehow identify the risk and maybe prevent the worst from happening? The signs were there, but they were ignored. The tragedy still had one last development. Okay, but why? In February 2020, Louise's mother, Lexi, and Scarlett's grandmother was found dead. She took her own life 2 years after the death of her granddaughters. According to reports, she was tormented by guilt and the pain of not being able to prevent what happened. And it's sad, isn't it, to know that these thoughts are almost suffocating, right? When, after things happened, there was a bit of everything there, right? Negligence from this mother, disdain, domestic violence, failure in the system, maybe, who knows, collective responsibility there, right? From people close by, friends, neighbors, relatives, even authorities. That story, right? After the milk spilled on the table, everyone sees it. But what about before, right? Wasn't there turbulence in the glass? Louise Porton joined a select list of criminals studied by psychology and also by criminology. And, contrary to what many people think, she did not have any serious mental disorder that prevented her from understanding reality or the seriousness of her own actions. She knew exactly what she was doing. It's a lot of cruelty, isn't it, guys? It's a lot of evil. Sometimes we keep trying to find reasons, right? But sometimes it's just evil for the sake of evil. It exists. In essence, it's not explainable. It's just there, you know? It's just there. And when we somehow identify it, there should be some precaution, but sometimes there's no time, right? But that's it. That's evil here. Maybe 2 reflections, right? That could fit here. Even though I think that for someone who takes the life of 2 children, one a year and a half old, the other 3, it's an entire life. Not to mention the karmic thing they'll carry, right? Because you literally took away all the experiences of 2 people. So, to wrap up here, I'd like to ask you to comment on this episode about what you think of parents who take the lives of their own children. You can use this case as a reference. Comment here for me, what do you think would be a fair sentence? This is almost like a philosophy book, right? Leave a comment so we can chat. That was today's episode. I really appreciate your company. A kiss from Rui until next time.